My name is Pastor Hal York, and welcome to Truth in the Trenches. Today we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 27, verse 8. Like a bird that wanders from her nest, so is a man who wanders from his home. Over the years, we've had several birds build nests around our deck. We've had doves, robins, all kinds of birds. It's always interesting, though, to watch them as the eggs hatch and the constant feeding begins. And you start to see them grow. As they grow, they start to flap their wings. We usually have 3 birds in the nest that we used to build. And once they get built, those nests start to get pretty crowded. And eventually they leave the nest. And one of the things you find once those birds, little birds, leave the nest, they can fly, they don't come back. Now, the mother bird may find them and continue to feed them for a while, but once they leave the nest, they're gone. They may hang around the nest, but eventually you don't see them anymore. They fly away. And that's just a very natural part of life. But one of the sad things is when you see one too young to fly fall out of the nest because maybe they were curious or they're just too excited or too energetic or one of their siblings pushed them out because it was too crowded for whatever reason. But they can't fly. And most don't survive. And all they can do when they fall out of the nest is just start to wander. And birds weren't meant to wander, they were meant to fly. And the more they wander, the further they get from the place of safety and provision. They've strayed from where they belong. And they wandered afar, not flown, but wandered, and tragedy awaits for most of them. And that's the analogy the writer uses to describe a man who wanders from his home. He wanders from the place that God has called him. Maybe slowly, imperceptibly, unintentionally at first, but they're wandering. If you're married, God has called you to be a husband, to love your wife as Christ loved the church, to care for her, to protect her, to provide for her. And the same is true for a woman. We are called to love our husbands, and so on. But if you're a father or a mother, you're called by God to raise your children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, to provide for them, to love them, to care for them, to lead them, to teach them, to be an example, to love their mother, to love their father. And especially for men, this is directed at men, I think, generically, or not generically, but genetically. He's talking about men. And yes, such responsibilities, such callings are restrictive. You're not single anymore. You have to make sacrifices. But the joy you get from those relationships is worth the sacrifice. You're committed to your spouse. You're committed to your children. You're committed to God who called you into these relationships. Proverbs 28:20 says, "A faithful man will abound with blessings, but whoever hastens to be rich will not go unpunished." To think like this is a mark of maturity. It's a mark of having grown up. But sadly, we see a trend in our culture of young men and older men who've never grown up, who are listening to the world. The world is telling them to think of yourself first. If you're being held down, if you're being held back, it's time to think about yourself. It's time to leave the nest. It's time to fly away and live for yourself and pursue what you want. This can be done literally. You can walk out of the family, the marriage, leave the wife and children behind, and it happens far too often. Or it can happen in our hearts. We're still there physically, but our hearts have wandered, and they're a long way away. Wandering, looking at greener pastures where there's no responsibilities. Sounds great. The Proverbs 20, verse 6 says this, "Many a man proclaims his own steadfast love, but a faithful man who can find?" That one would think that with so many men proclaiming faithfulness, that a faithful man would not be hard to find. But apparently they are a rare commodity. Homes across North America need such men, but where are they? Churches need such men, but where are they? Obviously, the answer is not going to be found by talking to men because they just keep proclaiming their own steadfast love. They keep saying there's no problem. And they will tell you repeatedly to listen to what they're telling you. However, despite all the talk of faithfulness and steadfast love, the search in many homes still goes on for a faithful man. Sadly, many wives could echo the frustration generated by such a question. Many a child is left home angry and disillusioned by such harsh realities. Far too many homes today are filled with absentee husbands and fathers, men who may be present in the home physically but have checked out emotionally, men who make lots of promises and are full of good intentions, but that's all it ever amounts to. They're not engaged in the lives of their spouse or their children. There's a lot of talk, a lot of someday, but someday never comes. Many men today are in their own little world, and the wife and the children know it, despite the grand proclamations to the contrary. It's so easy to say things, to make moving affirmations of steadfast love, but words without action are hollow, meaningless, and worthless. They've left the nest. They're living in their own world. They're living for themselves. And they're not coming back, barring a miracle of God's grace in their life. Horatius Bonar has said this, very strong words, but I think worth repeating. Be men in courage, not cowards, turning our back to the foe or giving way in danger or reproach or evil days. In solidity, not shifting or shadowy, but immovable as the rock. In strength, as the man is, so is his strength. Be strong in wisdom. Foolishness is with childhood, wisdom with manhood. Speak and act with wisdom as men. In understanding, be men. In all things, what you do and what you refrain from doing, be men. Act the manly part. Let nothing effeminate, sickly, childish, puny, little, narrow be seen about you. Christianity makes men, not babes. Adorn the doctrine of Christ by your manliness. In the church, in the world, in business, in conversation, in prosperity and adversity, act like men. Let no man despise you, and let no one despise the gospel because of you. Men are needed, wanted, real men, godly men, men who are dead to self and alive to God. Like a bird that wanders from her nest, so is a man who wanders from his house. 1 Corinthians 16:13. Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. Be steadfast and immovable, Paul says in chapter 15 of Corinthians, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Where's your heart, man? Where's your heart? Are you wandering? Have you literally wandered in your heart? Have you left emotionally? Your wives, your children need you to be engaged in their lives, loving to the glory of God and for their own good. And so don't wander. Be a man. Act like men. Be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. May this truth guide us and guard us in the trenches of life as we seek to live our lives for the glory of God and the good of others. May God bless.